come in.
We're so excited to have you join us this afternoon.
I'll say about a couple of more minutes, give folks time to jump off other calls and transition, and we can go ahead and get started, Patrice.
All righty, sounds good. Cynthia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. Hey, Patrice, we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, okay. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Here we go.
All right. Well, good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today for our seminar series. And today's seminar topic is soil health tools and strategies. And we have a very special guest here who is an expert in the field, and we are so happy to have her. Next slide, please. Before we get started and dive into today's presentation, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Freedmen Heirs Foundation website along with our YouTube page. We will also send this webinar link to all participants post the meeting. So probably sometime next week, so be on the lookout for that. We ask for all attendees to please keep your microphones muted so that we just minimize distractions throughout the presentation. Also, the chat and Q&A functions are enabled. We ask that if you have any questions or emergencies, please use the chat. However, for questions regarding Dr. Bagnall's presentation, please use the Q&A function. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Freedmen Heirs Foundation. I am Seneca Edwards Heron. I'm the founder and executive director here at Freedmen Heirs Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization that supports Black farmers across the United States. We have a tagline of bridging the gap between Black farmers and the marketplace. We focus on 3 topical areas. One is technical assistance. The second is access to capital and resources. And the third is creating and opening doors to new market opportunities. We ask that if you would like to know more about Freedmen Heirs Foundation, please contact myself, Seneca Edwards Heron, or Patrice Lazard, who is the project manager at Freedmen Heirs Foundation. Or you can visit our website at freedmenheirs.org, or you can check us out on social media platforms. We do have a Facebook page, an Instagram page, and also a LinkedIn page. Next slide, please. So without further ado, we have a special guest in Dr. Dianna Bagnall. She is a research soil scientist at the Soil Health Institute. Dr. Bagnall serves as a research soil scientist for the Soil Institute. She is an applied soil physicist specializing in soil health and socioeconomic dynamics of soil management. Her research includes developing functions that show the effect of soil carbon on plant available water, selection of the most effective soil health indicators for the North American continent, on-farm soil health assessments, qualitative analysis of farmer interviews, development of novel soil structure scanning methodology, and both measurement and modeling of preferential water flow and shrink swell soils. From 2014 to 2016, she served as a project manager for AgriLife, Research's Corporate Relations Office, developing proposals and managing projects. She managed sponsored research projects in soil and crop science, renewable energy, and agricultural engineering. Dr. Bagnall received a master's degree and PhD from Texas A&M University. She is the early career board representative for the Soil Science Society of America, the 2024 vice chair of the Land Management and Conservation section of the Agronomy Society of America, and an associate editor for Vados Zones Journal. Without further ado, I would like to turn our time over today to Dr. Bagnall for her presentation. Thank you, Dr. Bagnall.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Seneca, and thanks, Patrice, as well for all your work in getting this set up. Now the hardest part is to see if we can get the right slides in the right place, so let's see how we do. How's that looking to everyone?
Great, we got it.
Okay, awesome. Well, again, thank you both. I'm so pleased to be here at talking with at this webinar series with the Freedmen Heirs Foundation. And I wanted to share today some soil health tools and strategies that the Soil Health Institute has been involved with. And I'd love, as we go through this, to have your feedback on, the tools that you see would be the most helpful for you. The Soil Health Institute is a relatively young organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to safeguard and enhance the vitality and productivity of soils. And we look at doing that through scientific research and advancement. And when we think about soil health, we use the NRCS, USDA NRCS definition, which is the vitality and productivity of soils that we think about when we think about the soils as a system that supports plants and animals and humans. And so it's really a holistic concept, which is one of the things I love about it. And I wanted to talk to you today about our comprehensive approach, the way that we think about making a change, having the benefits for our communities and for our society that flow out of soils. And as I decided the best way to do that and to describe that comprehensive approach, I realized we had a really awesome short video that I wanted to share with you. And so I'll be using that to talk through our comprehensive approach. But before I offer that, I just want to say a few words, a little bit more about soil health, that it's probably a term that you've heard. And when you've heard some people talking about soil health, you might hear people saying, well, are you doing no-till? Are you using cover crops? And while those are awesome practices, we recognize that, farms are really diverse, and what works on one farm isn't going to work for the next farm. And so we try not to be prescriptive, but we try to think in terms of the principles of soil health. So when we think about increasing the presence of living roots in the soil, it could be that you're cover cropping, but it might be that you're double cropping, that you're changing your rotation, maybe putting wheat in that rotation. And, maybe you're reducing disturbance by going all the way to no-till. That's great. But maybe you're using strip tillage. Or maybe you have a really intensive production system like peanut where, frankly, you're going to have to go through and really disturb the soil to harvest that crop. And so soil health might look different for you. So we could continue walking through examples, but I think one of the take home here is just that our goal is that we are able to support soil health management systems that integrate the practices that work for you, for your farms, and that provide you the soil health outcomes for your production goals in your community, not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so with that background about soil health, I wanted to go ahead and share this video. Let me know. Hopefully we get playing here and everything works out. Let's try us again here. Uh-oh, we came out of presentation mode, it looks like. I'm afraid we got technical issues. Let's see if we can fix this. Sorry about that, folks. I did say it was the hardest part, but I was cocky enough to think that I got it figured out already. So how about this?
Fabrics to clothe the world. Soil supports 95% of all global food production. By 2050, our soils will have to feed an estimated 9.8 billion people. That's 2 billion more than our current world population. Our soils will also help us provide cotton and other natural fabrics to clothe the world and grow our bioenergy crops. Food, fiber, fuel. Soils are vital. They filter water. They are one of our most cost-effective reservoirs for sequestering carbon. They are our foundation for biodiversity. A healthy soil is vibrantly alive, teeming with 10,000 pounds of biological life in every acre. Yet, in the last 150 years, we've lost half of the basic building block that makes soil productive. The societal and environmental costs, soil loss and degradation in the United States alone are now estimated to be as high as $85 billion every single year. An abundance of research shows that practices which improve soil health also reduce nutrient loss to our waterways, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sequestration, increase biodiversity, and provide many other benefits. But it's going to be our land managers, primarily our farmers and ranchers, that will achieve those benefits for the rest of us. That is why the Soil Health Institute employs a comprehensive strategy to increase adoption of soil health systems. The first step is to understand what producers need when deciding whether to adopt new management practices. Producers tell us one of the first pieces of information they need is the business case. Will the recommended system be profitable? Will it increase or reduce my economic risk? Can the environmental benefits be credited back to my farm? Producers also say they need to know how to measure the health of their soil so they can determine its current status and monitor their progress at improving soil health. Producers need locally relevant information to help them develop and implement a soil health management plan that works for them and their farm. At the heart of that training is a requirement that it is based on sound science. Research and development are fundamental for reducing business risk and making new management decisions with confidence. Once these soil health systems are adopted, it is critical that we assess their impact on productivity because this supports and refines the business case and provides the evidence-based information required for making sound policy. Assessing impact also provides the data needed for educating consumers on the environmental benefits and perhaps even human health benefits of growing our food, fiber, and fuel using soil health systems. Imagine the progress we can make at scale towards improving water quality, feeding the hungry, fighting climate change, providing pollinator habitat. When consumers have learned about these benefits and demand that their food be grown using practices that enhance soil health. This is the comprehensive strategy that the Soil Health Institute uses and offers to effect positive change at scale for farmers, the environment, and ultimately for society. The task at hand is more than any one organization can achieve alone. Many partners are already working together to enhance soil health, but so much more is needed. All are invited to participate and make soil health the cornerstone for managing our natural resources around the world. We and all future generations have a critical stake in the outcome. We invite you to become involved today in one of the boldest movements in agricultural and environmental history. Join us.
Great. Well, thanks for your patience on that. Hopefully the quality of that sound was really good. I wanted to start here because I felt like it was great to take that comprehensive approach and understand that we want to head somewhere. And where we want to head is enabling widespread adoption of these soil health systems that support our communities economically and our environment as well. And as the video said, one of the first questions that growers rightly ask is, what are the economics of this system going to be? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about our work in economics. Primarily, we've used a tool that we call a partial budget analysis. And the idea is that we would be looking at those folks who have already adopted soil health management systems. So this is not a survey of everyone who's ever tried these programs. We're looking at folks who really have been successful, and we sit down with them and we ask them, what changes have you made in your operation between the time that you were using more conventional practices and going to soil health management systems? And this usually occurs over a period of time. So in the data that I'm showing you here, we're looking at growers who had been using soil health management systems, particularly using reduced tillage and cover crops for about 9 years. And as we sit down with them and we ask, what changes, we record that. And you can see we do it by crop. So we have here information for corn, and that the units are in dollars per acre, but also we have soybeans. And so as you can see from the slide, there were 63 corn farmers, 64 folks growing soybeans, and all the numbers you see here are the average of those folks. And so what our process looks like is to sit down and see on average what these various expense categories look like. So there's broadly two components of our net farm income, our expenses, and then what we get in terms of revenue from yield. In this table, we're just looking at expenses to try and understand how soil health management will affect those expenses. So it might be a little odd at first that you could have both a benefit or reduced expense, but also a cost or an additional expense in the same category. So for example, suppose our growers that we spoke with, maybe they changed their row spacing or their rotations a bit, so they were able to save some on crop seed. That might be that $6.97 we see there under seed for corn. But perhaps they also used cover crops. That would be an additional expense. They had both a reduced expense and an additional expense related to seed costs. So how we would imagine we'd do that is say, all right, we have about $20 to the good, but we also had about a $7 cost. So the difference between those two being about $13, overall our seed costs would have gone down by about $13. And we do that for each crop, and we do it for each of these different categories. And what we typically see with all of the work that we've done, I think we're probably nearing 150 farm interviews. And what we see is that a lot of folks are able to save on fertilizers and amendments. That's the big kind of difference in these categories. You see a reduced expense of $27.11 for corn for fertilizers and amendments, $12.90 of reduced expense for soybean. And then you see some small additional expenses. So this is a real cost savings where growers are saying, I have better soil organic carbon, I have better nutrient cycling, I'm not having to put out the same amounts of fertilizer that I used to, or maybe I'm able to save on some lime. We have modest savings in pesticides here, but we also see savings in terms of fuel and especially in equipment ownership. And this is a theme that we see, especially those the use of reduced tillage. We have less wear and tear on our equipment, and we have to make fewer passes in the field. So when we do all of this, it averages out, and we are able to say that the change in net farm income per acre for corn was $23.09, whereas for soybean, it was $17.82. And again, that's on a per acre basis. So we can think about this as kind of an idea of what we might expect in the long run if we were to change our management systems from a more conventional approach to soil health. But I mentioned there's also those components of yield. And so that would be another thing we'd need to think about in terms of our net farm income. And I'll come to that in just a moment. But we use this process, I kind of dove into the weeds a little bit here, so to speak. We've used the same interview process with our agricultural economist to create individual case studies. And I've put a QR code here in case you're interested in taking a look at some of those case studies. This particular link is going to take you to individuals at 30 different farms across 20 US states. And whereas the last slide was really just corn and soy, there's more variety of crops in this group, where we have about 14 different crops, including some perennials. I can see that in this fact sheet, alfalfa, oats, and corn and soy were all grown on that farm. This was awesome because these were producers who were really willing to sit down with us and tell us what worked for them. And so there may be something that's similar or has some relation to the soil health management systems that you're thinking about. So this could be a good tool to get an idea of where you might see some cost savings. And you can see that this dollar value of $65 an acre is quite a bit larger than on the last slide. And that's because it has the cost savings component, but as well, many of these growers were able to see benefits to their yield. So they had both a revenue increase and a cost reduction contributing to that value. So in addition to these kind of case studies that zoom in to a particular farm and can get very detailed, we also have more regional case studies. I've already showed you some data from our corn and soy surveys, and we're currently working in cotton. We have fact sheets out for Texas and Georgia. And for this approach, what we're really trying to do is characterize a region and give you a little bit more of an average. So for example, in the right-hand corner here, you see that we're characterizing the Texas High Plains, which is a cotton producing region. When we're having these interviews with these farmers, we're asking them about their economics, but we're also asking them about some things that are a little harder maybe to put a number to. Things like increased field access. You see this table 4 here, where we're saying, are you seeing year on year that as you have a better soil health, that you maybe can get into the field and plant a bit earlier, or that you're able to have better conditions for harvest? And in this case, 93% said yes. Then we asked them, do you think that using soil health has made your yield more stable, and has that helped improve your loan or your land agreements, or has that increased insurance terms? Less than half said yes. So some folks were seeing that, but not everyone. Of course, as we know, everyone's situation is a little bit different. This was interesting to me that we asked them, do we think it protects your license to operate? By which we mean, do you think that your neighbors or the people that you are doing business with think that you're a more responsible grower because you're taking in these environmental considerations into account? And 98% of the growers said, yeah, we do think that that's of value to us. So hopefully these are some resources that may be useful to you or to growers you know. To just summarize our notes on these two pieces of economic work, we've seen that adopting conservation tillage has some immediate benefit because it reduces the expenses that you might have, like fuel or equipment usage. Now, planting cover crops oftentimes has an additional expense to it, and we want to recognize that if we go out and make that investment, we're going to have to pay for seed, which we otherwise wouldn't have to. For the long term, averaging 9 years, for example, in our 100-farm study, cover crops did lead to reduced expenses and to increased yield that did compensate for them. But that is a longer game proposition. So we would always advise to get advice from folks in your area and to start small if you're thinking about implementing some of these changes. So really, we want to be able to think about this transition period in which we do have additional costs and weigh those out with the benefits that we think may represent farms in our area. And we're hoping that these economic tools provide some decision support for growers who are considering whether or not this change is right for them. So we've talked about the economics of soil health. That's what growers have told us. That's the first thing they need to be considering. But if they're past that and they think, yeah, I'd be interested in thinking more seriously about soil health, then the next question is, how will I know if I've been successful? And this is where we want to talk about measuring soil health. A lot of the work that the Soil Health Institute has been doing in the last almost 10 years has been in regard to how do we measure soil health? And the cornerstone of this was a project that happened it was initiated in 2019. And for this project, there were 124 different long-term experimental sites across Mexico, the United States, and Canada that SHI folks actually went out and measured. Now, we didn't create all these sites. They were already in place with Extension or USDA or other groups that had them. So we needed many, many partners to do this work. But the value of it was that we could have the same samples taken, the same methodologies applied, so that it was really comparable, but we got to use all these different areas. So we could try and find a suite of soil health indicators that would be a minimum. And when I say a minimum, I mean that we initially started with 30 different indicators at every one of these sites that was measured. But it's simply not going to be cost effective for our growers to take 30 different measurements of soil health and then try to interpret all of them. So we wanted to be able to reduce that down. An important part of the fact that we use these experimental sites is not just that there's diversity in the soils across this huge geographic area and weather, but also that they had the management systems in place that we're interested in. I know it might sound a little odd to think about, but so often our soils databases in the world, and certainly in the US, don't contain a lot of information about management. They contain a lot of information about the depth of the soil and where we were and what kinds of soils were there and how much clay is in the soil. But when we're interested in asking management questions of a database, we need to be thinking, well, did someone use different management in this practice? And so we were really happy to be able to sample a wide variety of management changes like decreased tillage, the use of cover crops, crop rotation, and so on. And this led us to be able to publish peer-reviewed papers, which you can find at the link that I have down here. If you go to soilhealthinstitute.org under our work, the initiative is called Measurements, and we have the papers, some summaries of the papers, and some videos explaining the process by which we came to a minimum suite of soil health indicators. Now, I've got 3 on the screen, and they're different measurements. So they have methods that would go along with this that could be sent to the lab. I'm going to talk about a 4th indicator later that you don't actually have to go to the field and measure. But for now, I just wanted to mention these 3. Organic carbon concentration, of course, there's a lot of focus on carbon and carbon markets these days, and a foundation of that is measuring organic carbon concentration. But we chose it not only because it responded to management across these 124 sites, but also because it tells us something about nutrient cycling and retention, how stable our soils can be, and how much water they can hold for our crops. The second measurement was carbon mineralization potential. If you've worked in the soil health world, you might have heard this referred to as the burst of CO2. And the idea is that it's telling us something about our microbial biomass and how active our microbes are. And then lastly, we had aggregate stability, which tells us about the resistance of our soil to wind and water erosion. And also it can tell us something about whether or not we think our soils will infiltrate and store water very well. The really exciting thing about that last one, aggregate stability, is that we measured very tediously 4 different ways of assessing aggregate stability. And one of them was really new. It was actually using an iPhone, a phone app, a smartphone, to be able to take a picture of the soil and look at how when we wet that soil, it expands or slakes. And so I want to tell you a little bit more about that. I've got a picture here on the left where we have a phone, and yes, that is a very professional soup can that I have taken masking tape and taped a phone to be able to take a picture of some nice little soil aggregates. We do research, but you know, hey, we got to get practical too sometimes. And this is great because then you can have lunch after you do your aggregate stability test. But we were able to validate this smartphone app and create a new app with the University of Sydney, and you can download it for free with the QR code that's in the upper right. And what it will show you is a picture like this, where it says, here's the initial image that we took of these aggregates. And at that time, they were stable, but then we put them in water. And after 10 minutes, they had slaked or gotten bigger as they kind of decomposed. And then we'll give you a score between 0, which is not very stable at all, and 1, which is totally stable. And so you see here, in this case, the aggregate stability index is 0.36. So you could think about that as like a 36% test score, maybe not so great. And then you're able to store different samples and have the value, the aggregate stability index for each of those. And I want you to think, as you see these samples right here, there's a big range. You know, sample 20 is at 0.82, sample 15 at the bottom is at 0.31. And you'd ask yourself, if these were your samples, well, what's the difference? Does this mean that the sample 15 is really unhealthy and sample 20 is really healthy? And the answer is maybe. So I'm going to come back to that here in just a little bit and talk about how we can interpret soil data and how you might be able to interpret on your farm. And you might use this on your farm and realize, you know, that you'd be measuring a change over time and you see that it gets more healthy. That would be great. But you might also compare your field to a neighbor's field, and maybe there's other things changing between your field and your neighbor's field too. So this is the last measurement that I wanted to share from the recommended suite, But then we also have another indicator I mentioned, and I want to share this because it's something that you've probably heard if you've been around the soil health world much at all, that as we increase our soil organic carbon, we increase our soil's ability to hold water for crops. I'm from Texas, and in Texas, water is what we need to make a crop, and there's not a lot of it sometimes. So if we can be a little more efficient and get our soil to capture a little more water, that's what we care about. Don't talk to me about carbon, talk to me about water, is what my farmers would tell me. So this chart that we see is from the peer-reviewed work that was published with this NAPSHM, or this study that we did of 124 sites. And you can see that as you get higher on the chart, you have more available water holding capacity, which is great. And so you can see that as you have more carbon, there's more water. And that's been a talking point for a long time. NRCS has known this for a long time, but we haven't had equations where we could really predict it and see what a small change in organic carbon due to management would do. And so now we're able to have an Excel spreadsheet, and I'll show you where you can download that if you want to, that you can put in your information and see what your available water holding capacity would be as your carbon changes. But you probably noticed while I was talking that there's not just carbon going on here. There's also clay content there at the bottom. And so whether or not your soil holds a lot of water or a little bit of water partly depends on how much clay and sand is in your soil. So if someone has a 20% clay, they start off with more plant available water than somebody who has a 40% clay. So not only does our management that changes carbon influence our soil health indicator or our outcome, but we also see that some things that we can't change, like how much clay is in our soil, influences the indicators of soil health. And so when we think about, well, I'll come back to that, but I do want to make sure I show you what I promised here on our website. If you're on our measurements page, our standard measurement methods has all the methods that we used so that laboratories can follow them, but it also has an Excel spreadsheet you can download it called Predicting Available Water Holding Capacity. And you can play with the sand and clay and soil organic carbon that you have in your soil to see how your soil could change its plant available water as you grabbed more carbon when you change your management. Okay, so now that we've got that little housekeeping out of the way, let's come back to what I was saying. And I said this a little bit when we were talking about aggregate stability. I said it again when we were just talking about plant available water. We want to know how our management changes our soil health measurement. So we have these indicators that we can use, and we're interested in seeing if I start going to no-till and cover crops, what's going to happen to my soil health measurements. But remember that clay also influenced our soil health measurements. And so that's what we would call an inherent property of soil. You can do whatever you'd like, but your soil will still have the same percent clay, no matter whether you till it or you don't till it, or you put cover crops in it or you don't. And the same is true for aggregate stability. It might be more stable if it has one soil amount of clay in it versus another. And then farmers, of course, know that because they know spots in their field that do produce well and don't produce well. So they already understand that their yield is depending on inherent soil properties. And they also know that it depends on what we would call scientist, regional, and site characteristics. But you might think about this as like, in a different county across from you, they might have different weather. And that's going to influence whether or not their soils have a one amount of organic carbon or another. So how can we make sense of soil health measurements? We started saying we need to be able to measure soil health, but now I'm telling you that the measurement you get is going to depend on all this other stuff. And so how do you know if you're doing well or if you're not doing well? I mean, one way would be to just take a soil health measurement and wait 5 years and see if it got better, but that seems like it's going to take too long. So a lot of the work that we're doing now is in a concept that we call soil health benchmarking. And there's a great video that explains it a little bit more detail with this QR code. But the idea is we want to be able to set reasonable levels for your specific soil, knowing how much sand and clay is in your soil, knowing the weather that's local to you. And the way we do this is we look at a particular soil. So here's an example from a grower in Georgia we sampled on their farm. And they had 80% sand in their soil. And they had a soil organic carbon percentage of 8%, or 0.8%. So that's not a whole lot of carbon. And maybe this person has heard that, wow, growers who went to no-till and cover crops in Iowa, man, they have 5% soil organic carbon. And they're not feeling so great about themselves because they have 0.8% soil organic carbon in Georgia. But what we do is we sample these other different soils, not just theirs, but we can tell them this green box is the benchmark or the best case scenario that's local to them. And that might be a perennial system that has living roots almost all year round, and it's never disturbed. So that's the best that soil could possibly do. Then in the gold, we have the baseline. Maybe those are some folks who aren't so mindful of their soil health, and maybe they're doing a few practices that aren't the best that could be done. And then we have the folks using soil health management systems in blue. They're really trying to push the envelope and innovate. Notice they haven't made it all the way to the benchmark. It's really hard in a cropping system where we have to do some work and get out there and disturb some soil, and we have to harvest our crop, which doesn't always have to happen in a perennial system. But we also see that we have a realistic benchmark, something that works for us. We're not comparing ourselves to 5% soil organic carbon in Iowa. And so our goal here is to eventually, as you'll see in the video if you are interested in watching it, provide maps where growers can understand for their soil health group and for their region how healthy their soils can be. So hopefully this is something that really takes the measurement work that we've done and provide the context for growers to be able to answer the question, how healthy is my soil now? And how healthy could it be? Okay, so I've talked a lot about measurements. I'm a soil nerd, so I mean, I think it made sense that I would spend a lot of time on that. But I also want to talk about another one of those boxes in our comprehensive strategy, which was about soil health education. And I don't have a whole lot of slides here. And the reason is because we don't have a whole bunch of material that we try to use to tell growers what they should be doing. What we do have is the desire to set up networks to empower farmers to connect with other farmers and technical specialists local to them. So what we do when we take an educational approach is we try to make it really regional, and we locate partners who are technical specialists. They might be at universities or in NRCS or in extension, soil and water conservation. And those are the folks who can help kind of direct traffic when they get questions about how can I get this grower the resources that they need. And so they would have a small contract and we would be able to support their time for that. And then most importantly, maybe, is looking to farmer mentors, farmers who are local and have made soil health management systems work for them. I've worked a lot in cotton growing soils, being a native Texan. And so the example that I have of a farmer network here is that from one of our cotton projects, where we have technical specialists and farmer mentors in all these locations, the Texas High Plains, the Texas Blackland Prairie, but Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. So again, our goal is not to like parachute in some soil scientists to start telling folks what they need to be doing, but rather to build from the ground up and harvest that local knowledge of folks who really know how to make it successful and build partnerships there. So we've talked about some of the ways that we hope we can increase adoption of soil health management systems. We've talked about the business case, we've talked about measurement, and now we've talked about education. I have just a few other slides I want to show, and they're around our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is certainly a journey for us. Speaking candidly, I'm a soil scientist, a geoscientist, and we have some of the worst numbers when it comes to diversity in our sciences. And we at SHI think that that's something that we'd like to be able to change and to improve. And one of our approaches is to sponsor an internship program. And we have, actually the internship is open right now. I've got a QR code if you know a student who you think would benefit from being a part of the internship program. You see some of the partners from our past interns. We've had about 15 go through our program, partner with a soil scientist, and get to do some science and do some analysis and present their work. And so we hope that this program continues to grow in the future, and we'd love your feedback on it or your recommendations of ways that we can share it. So with that, that's the list of all the things that I had prepared. So I think what I'll do is I'll hand it back over to Seneca at this point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bagnall, for such an insightful presentation. I always enjoy talking with you because I feel like I am a sidekick soil scientist because I always learn something. I will start off asking a couple of questions. I would like to encourage our participants to please ask questions, put them in Q&A, and we can direct them to Dr. Bagnall. First question for you. It's a lot of great questions. You went over a lot of things. What are the top strategies that you recommend for farmers to improve the health of their soil, and how can they measure the improvements over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as we talked about, everyone's situation is different, but I think, I did some survey work with some growers, and it was really interesting. I'll tell a little bit of a story here where we were interviewing growers who had adopted soil health management practices and those who hadn't. And we're asking them, why did you make the choice that you made? And both of groups said, economics, and both groups said they cared about their soil. But we were trying to figure out what's the difference between these two groups of farmers. And it came out that, the guys, all of a sudden, we realized the people who were in the adopters group, they all had each other's phone numbers. And the ones who were not were very competitive with each other. And we're like, I'm not going to tell them what I'm doing because I've got my system working. And so that really told me that, mentorship and a sense of community is so important to being able to take these risks, and having somebody you can call and go like, I can't plant into this cover crop. Like, you got to help me. And so I would say, finding that network, and they don't all have to be local. You might find somebody who's trying innovative things. I'd be doing work in Arkansas and have them be talking about, hey, I'd heard this thing worked in North Carolina and I'm trying it. So reach out to people, find some other folks who are doing something that is interesting to you before you get started, and start small. And the joke is always like, don't start with your field on the road, because your neighbors are going to laugh at it the first time you start looking at these crazy cover crops. So start small, get some help, get some folks who can walk through that journey with you. And I can come up with all kinds of measurements that you could take. Like, I hope maybe the smartphone app would be a way that you could measure your progress over time. But I think as growers, you're going to know whether or not your system's working, whether or not you're seeing the yields that you want to see. When I've surveyed growers about what they see that's different when they measure their progress, they're saying, my neighbor's farm is ponded after that big rain. There's water sitting everywhere. Mine isn't, because I have better water infiltration. I think those are the most meaningful things that growers are going to observe themselves. But then we do have some tools to measure. And I should have mentioned that we were really pleased late in 2023 that minimum suite of soil health indicators was also approved through EQIP. So if you're someone who is looking to do testing through EQIP programs, then the minimum suite of indicators can also be reimbursable in the same way that that past groups of soil health indicators have been reimbursable in that program.
That's great. That's wonderful to hear about that collaboration and connection, and the things that you implement or a producer can implement on their farm is also applicable in other places as well. So that's always wonderful to know. This question, I think we've talked about it before, but I would like for you to share your insights to the group. What is your vision for the future of soil health? And what do you hope can be achieved over the next decade?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as a soil scientist, the reason I work in soil health is because I really believe that it's one of those really rare things in life where it's a win for everybody. It's good for the growers, it's good for consumers, it's good for society, it's good for the soil, it's good for the environment. And so my vision is that, our policy, our economic systems, our consumer choices would really, support the good work of our growers to care for the land, and that we recognize that's the case. I think more and more you see that consumers are interested in the effects of the choices that we make on the land. And I think growers have known this for a long time. And so being able to support those growers and compensate them for the extra hard work that they might be doing to make sure that that they're growing the best food that they can is really important, food and fiber. So that vision is really broad. And to me, in the next 10 years, I do hope that we're able to enable a soil health benchmarking program that becomes so easy and so simple that any grower can say, I know what my benchmark is, and I know that I've gotten, so close to it. And so they have a way to advocate for themselves and show the work that they've done in a just, really scientifically robust way. And that the people purchasing goods from them, go, hey, I know that I'm buying the cotton, the corn, the vegetables, the almonds from healthy soil because I can see this. So I think in 10 years, I hope that we'll have that accessibility, and we'll be calling those folks to support the growers who are making those changes on their soil.
Absolutely. I think, from my perspective, I'm not a soil scientist, I'm an ag economist, but also just growing up in agriculture, the soil is the building block for all production. Whether you're growing fruits, vegetables, specialty crops, row crops. And so it's very important to take care of the soil, to take care of the land. I know you mentioned during your presentation as well as the video, we know a lot and we hear a lot about regenerative agriculture and climate change and carbon sequestration. But I think getting back to just the basic layer of everything, it all goes back to the soil, and that's the building block. So I think that that's very important that you drew that out. And I think going forward, I agree with you wholeheartedly that, producers, we do want them to have the benefit that comes along with being a good steward of the land. And for consumers, they are becoming very conscious of where their food is produced, how it's produced, and there is a willingness to pay, extra or a premium for those items that they feel check the box for them for their own personal preferences. I will check the chat. We have one question from you from a Mr. Tom Savage. I hear that the more humus that the soil has, the better soil for growing plants. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a word that is really has the same meaning. I was describing it as soil organic carbon, but I think that that's true. And as we're able to, we saw the graph that was showing we have more carbon, we can store more water. And so that's a major goal. Of course, it's different in different places how much carbon we can put in our soils. But I think it's also a focus, of course, of the climate smart commodity grants and the focus on climate smart agriculture is being able to put carbon in our soils for a climate or environmental reason. But what I think is, so important about that is not that we get, tunnel vision and look just at the humus or the carbon, but that we're also see it's part of that cycle that benefits our water and our aggregate stability and reduced erosion. And so, yeah, I think a lot of our growers, our gardeners even, are really familiar with adding compost or things to soils that are going to benefit their crops. And that's the best tomatoes I've ever had for sure. Had there was a lot of compost in those soils.
All right. Thank you so much for asking that question. Another question for you, Dr. Bagnall. With your extensive experience at the Soil Health Institute, what are some of the most surprising or significant findings your research has uncovered about soil health in recent years?
Yeah, I didn't go into a lot of depth, but when we had the chart of plant available water, that was really so interesting because the way that we did the analysis was really common. It had been done by other people, and so often they had found that the results of adding more carbon to soil maybe didn't show as strong a value as our farmers and our growers would indicate to us. And we did two things differently than the other studies. One, we made sure we had management in the experimental design in the study. So we would know how going to no-till and going to cover crops would benefit our available water holding capacity. And the other thing is that a lot of the scientists who had taken those measurements would go take a soil sample, they would dry it out, they would grind it up to where there was, nothing, no structure left in it, and then they would do their measurement and they would find, oh, this doesn't really help any when we have more carbon. But what we did is we took an intact core and we looked like a soup can, and we would take that and we would take it back to the lab intact, and we would look at the structure of the soil, and then we would measure plant available water holding capacity. And that was a lot of the difference. And so to me, what I learned from that was really powerful, that we sometimes as scientists can just take a database and do some analysis and not really think about, did this come from the real life, the real world system that I care about? And if it doesn't, then maybe my analysis is not what I would hope it would be. And also just that it's our intact soil structure that our growers get to observe in their fields, that's really showing the change. And so that to me, it was a pleasant surprise, but it was really just stark to see that that was important to carry those real world things into our science.
Wonderful. We have another question in the chat. If you were to choose one indicator, SOC, soil CO2, and aggregate stability, what will be the key measure of soil health? That's part A. And part B is, would you please order your choice? So I'm assuming that they want you to order
Yeah.
from agency. So that's a good
That's
question.
a good question. That's a hard one. Because I wrote the paper on picking 3. They didn't make me narrow it down to 1. Well, my background is studying water and soil a lot. And so if I had to pick one, I would pick aggregate stability for 2 reasons. One, because I do, as I just was talking about, think that the structure of our soils intact and in the field is so important. And you could put a lot of carbon in a soil, but you could really, really till it up so much and destroy it, and it might not hold that as much water as if you had those great aggregates. The other reason I would pick aggregate stability is there's a smartphone app that's really cool that you can measure it with. And so that I could do myself. I wouldn't have to send off to the lab. So if I had to pick one, and truthfully, I'm kind of joking a little bit there because they're all connected. Like our soils that have higher organic carbon usually do have better aggregate stability. So I think I would pick aggregate stability. The next thing I would say, though, is organic carbon concentration, if I had to pick the next one. And I think it is such a universal indicator, as one of the other questions that we had indicated, that's so important for crop growth. And there's a lot of focus right now on carbon too, so it would be good to know how much carbon my soil has in it. But if I were really worried about my production and I had to pick one, I think I would go with aggregate stability.
Wonderful. So we are coming close to our time. I do want to leave space for you to provide any insights or any key takeaways that you would like to provide to our audience.
Wow. Well, I thank you for your time. This has been really great. And I would say, I think that we're, as a young institute, really interested in learning more about how we can provide the outputs that really work with farmers. We're, gearing up in terms of our education program. And so I would say that I think soil health, it's a great time to be a soil scientist, and it's a great time to be interested in soil health. And so this is really more work, as the video said, than any one organization can do. And so if there are opportunities to partner or to learn more about how we can support the adoption of soil health management practices, certainly give me a call or an email. I'm easy enough to find out on the internet. You can find my email. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Bagnall, for your time today. Thank you for your expertise and sharing with us. We have a couple of announcements before we will end our recording. First one. Our next webinar is April 16th at 1:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. That's 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And the topic will be from local farms to national markets, diversifying supply chains through wholesale partnerships. You do not want to miss that webinar as well. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions, but you can look at the QR code to get further information or to register for that webinar series. Next slide, please. So again, we thank you all for participating in the webinar today. We look forward to hearing your feedback, and we will send out a link to the video as well as any other additional information from today's webinar. Thank you again. Enjoy your afternoon and have a great week. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Bagnall.